evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Sharon Bown, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Lieutenant Megan Hall. Today's Last Post ceremony honours women who are united by defence. In particular, we honour the broad scope of service, sacrifice, and contribution of current and ex-serving women in the Australian Defence Force, widows of the Australian Defence Force, and women and their families whose lives have been affected as a result of service. We are honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Opposition, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, representing the Chief of the Defence Force, Captain Philippe Petitier, Defence Attaché, representing the French Ambassador of Australia, the Honourable Darren Chester, Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Amanda Rishworth, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. We are also honoured to welcome attending members of the 45th Parliament of Australia, the Australian Defence Force, Returned and Services League Australia, and the many representatives of veteran and serving organisations and associations who are joining us this evening to honour women united by defence. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that continue to serve, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria, and RSL Queensland, who are watching this broadcast across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors and students on behalf of Umina Public School, New South Wales. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I now invite you to please stand and join in singing the national anthem. Boys and girls, and anyone that wishes to be seated, please be seated. I would now like to invite Dr. Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, to deliver an address.
We pause here in the heart of the land they loved, on the 17th anniversary of events that on this day in 2001 changed our world, changed our nation's outlook on it, and changed our lives. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 civilian aircraft. 2 of them crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, a third into the Pentagon, and the 4th, the hijackers would be overcome by the civilian passengers and would crash in a field in Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 civilians were murdered. 700 more than were killed in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Our nation, the United States, and our allies in the civilized world realised that again we are in a generational struggle against totalitarianism. In this case, those who had hijacked the good name of Islam to build a violent political utopia. Those who were virulently opposed to nations, whether Judeo-Christian or Muslim, who respect political, economic and religious freedoms, the equal treatment of women, and the liberating power of education. As a consequence of those events and the murder of 88 Australians only a year later in Bali by 3 men who trained with Al-Qaeda under the protection of the Taliban in Afghanistan, our nation deployed men and women of the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force across operations into and supporting Afghanistan and then subsequently Iraq and more recently northern Iraq and Syria. We did so for many reasons, but one of them is that this place, those of you who are here wearing medals, whether on the left or the right, or who love and support those who serve or who have served, cloaked as we are by the names of 102,800 men and women who have given their lives, remind us of the truths by which we live that are worth fighting to defend. And as has always been the case, from the Boer War the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, Somalia, Iraq, a multitude of peacekeeping operations, the disproportionate burden of the defence of our nation, its interests and our values, has been carried by women. In the early years, women nursing, then also providing medical services, and then women increasingly, 70,000 of them in the Second World War, taking up a whole variety of roles in uniform. And then today, finally, almost, women serving in almost every rank and every occupation of the Australian Defence Force, but also a burden carried by mothers, wives, daughters, widows. On my left, at the end, is the Afghanistan Roll of Honour. It has 42 names on it. They're all men. But when I look at those names, I don't think of those men. I think instead of women, some of whom are here this evening. Jenny Pote, Ellie Lou Diddams, Elvie Wood, Bree Till, and many others. The woman standing on my immediate left has a lot of medals on her chest, on the left-hand side of her chest. That means that she has served our nation in uniform. Now a retired wing commander, Sharon Bown, a nurse, led a surgical team in Afghanistan. And in pre-dawn darkness here in 2014, in part she said this of her service: "I have awaited their return and tended their wounds, never able to fully comprehend the darkness of man that they encountered upon their journey. I've witnessed their adrenaline-fueled highs of survival and their immense depths of despair at the loss of a mate. I've laughed reservedly at the often black-humoured stories of soldiers who photographed their legs before a patrol just in case they never saw them again, and faced the reality of their need to loosely wear a tourniquet on each limb, ready to stem the inevitable hemorrhage that could end their life. I've been privileged to hear of unimaginable acts of bravery and self-preservation, and I've stood by silently to attempt to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. I have worn their blood. So many of us have worn their blood. And so many of the women that are here have worn the burden of the decisions made by our governments to send Australians in war, peace, humanitarian and disaster relief. And on this occasion, on the anniversary of events that changed us, that continue to shape and change us, we particularly honour and remember every woman who has served and serves not only in uniform, but in support, not only during those operations, but in another war that often begins when the person that she loves returns.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to staff nurse Norma Violet Mowbray. Norma Mowbray was born at St George in Queensland in 1883 to Thomas and Elizabeth Mowbray. While her father Thomas was a prominent police magistrate in Queensland, little is known about Norma's early upbringing or where she attended school. She later undertook nurses training at the Brisbane General Hospital and then went on to nurse at Warwick, before being appointed matron of the Charleville Hospital. At the time the First World War broke out, Mowbray was nursing privately in Brisbane. She enlisted in the AIF's Australian Army Nursing Services in November 1914. She was 31. More than 3,000 Australian civilian nurses volunteered for active service during the First World War. They were posted to Britain, France, Belgium, the Mediterranean, India and the Middle East, where they worked in hospitals, on hospital ships and trains, or in casualty clearing stations closer to the front line. Just 10 days after enlisting, Mowbray embarked at Brisbane on the transport ship Kiara, bound for Egypt. She was posted to No. 1 Australian General Hospital at Heliopolis in Egypt, where her patients included Australians wounded during the landings on Gallipoli and subsequent fighting on the Turkish peninsula. In October 1915, Mowbray was posted to nursing duty on board the ship Ulysses, which was returning to Australia with wounded and invalided men. She was able to visit her mother and sister during her return. She also gave an interview to Brisbane's Telegraph newspaper in which she praised the courage of Australians and said she felt proud to be a countrywoman of men who could remain cheerful and considerate even when racked by the most intense pain. Nurse Mowbray returned to Egypt in November on another troop ship. She had been back in Cairo just a few weeks when she was admitted to hospital with mild bronchitis on the 14th of January. She was discharged 4 days later and returned to duty. However, her condition quickly worsened, developing into pneumonia, and she was readmitted to hospital. She died at the 1st Australian General Hospital at Heliopolis on the morning of the 21st of January 1916. Nurse Mowbray's death was widely reported in the Queensland newspapers, and she was praised as one of the most successful nurses in the profession. The Bundaberg Mail reported, "The death of this noble young woman, whilst on duty's call, will be the cause of lament throughout this community, as well as amongst those who have learnt to love and worship her for the kindnesses and attentions our wounded and sick soldiers have always received at her hands." Staff nurse Norma Mowbray is buried in the Cairo War Memorial Cemetery in Egypt. Her name is listed on the Roll of Honour, on my right, among more than 60,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of her headstone is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Staff Nurse Norma Mowbray, who gave her life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall not grow old, as we who are left grew old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them. lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony.